So welcome to this episode of LawPod. I am Dr. Nora Burns and we're joined by Professor Lydia Bleasdale, Professor of Legal Education at the School of Law at University of Leeds. Lydia is Director of Community and Belonging at the Law School and Co-Director of the Centre for Innovation and Research in Legal Education. She's also a co-founder of the Connecting Legal Education Network and co-convenes the Advancing Wellness in Law International Network. She's written extensively about student resilience, belonging and identity. And in 2018, she won the National Oxford University Press Law Teacher of the Year Award. Welcome, Lydia, to LawPod.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, first question today is, why did you decide to study law in the first place? I know you're interested in criminal law and criminology, but why law?
Because I didn't know what else to do. So I was doing English, history, German A-levels, didn't want to pursue those any further. And didn't really know what else to do. I guess at the time, the kind of careers advice was very much geared towards you either do your A-level at further study or you do something that seems to kind of capture pre-existing skills that you're kind of deemed to have. And there was also, I would probably say at my school, a little bit of snobbery in terms of, you know, the types of subjects that were seen as worthy of further exploration. And so I ended up on this route of doing law because I was kind of perceived as being interested in and good at debating and arguing. I actually hate conflict and tend to go out of my way to avoid it and to take different approaches. But that was the perception. And so I ended up studying law because I basically didn't know what else to do. So I started it knowing that I didn't want to be a lawyer. I had at one point contemplated being a barrister. I had done some work experience and felt completely out of place, really didn't enjoy the atmosphere, some of the behaviour I witnessed. Again, this is going back quite a long time, but stuck with the decision to study law because, again, I didn't know what else to do. And so right from the off, felt a little bit like out of sync with everybody else who seemed to want to be a lawyer. So that's why I was doing the law degree.
Were there law teachers that you had in your undergrad that inspired you to become an academic or that you reflected on in your own practice now as an academic?
Yes, there were two. I mean, a primary one was my personal tutor from second year onwards, Professor Nick Taylor. So my first year was a very difficult year. I really struggled with the kind of different style of studying. It was very different, than it is now in terms of the kind of induction processes and I suppose the wider framework for studying law and helping people to feel like they've got the skills and, access to resources that they need to adapt to university study. There wasn't really a lot of that, or at least that's my reflection. And I really, really struggled. And when I say that, I mean, I didn't fail anything. I came very close to failing contract law. I didn't really understand when I did a bit better in various things. I didn't understand why. I didn't really understand why I hadn't done very well as well in some stuff. And I, at the end of my first year, had a mid 2-2. And like a lot of our students, I was used to being top of the class or near the top of the class, being known as a good student, being known as a hardworking student, all those other things. And yet here I was feeling like, okay, I don't want to be a lawyer, so I don't need a law degree. And now I'm not doing very well at it, or as well as I think I could do if I did another subject. So why am I putting myself through this? And so I really found that first year incredibly difficult. And then in my second year, I went to see this new personal tutor who I'd been allocated because I'd done okay in this exam, but I didn't really understand why. And so I asked him if he could just look through the paper with me. And he said, look, I'm not a torts lawyer, but we can have a chat. And he gave us some really, really helpful advice. And he was also teaching a human rights module that was only going on for the first semester of that term. But I finally understood something. I was genuinely interested in it. And I remember thinking, if I can't get a 2-1 in this, I will just have to leave because there's no point. I could do another degree and probably do better at that. So I put everything into that assessment, really, really loved it all. And he taught that module as well. And I got a first. And I remember being told the results by another member of staff who gave me the results and obviously looked at me beaming, and I burst into tears. And I think he just thought, what on earth is going on? Why are you? Whoa, this is good news, right? And I said to him I was going to leave if I didn't get a 2-1. And he probably thought I was being overly dramatic, but it had been building up for so long. I'd been so unhappy. And then in combination with that, I think there was just something that clicked in terms of that module, learning how to approach the assessment, how to think about the law, that I was able to then apply to other legal modules. But I also deliberately chose a lot of criminology and criminal justice modules. And so there was another member of staff, Professor Adam Crawford, who he taught a lot of those modules, and I just loved them. I loved the different way of thinking about things, the fact that it was people-centred. It was about trying to, understand circumstances and behaviour and why people do what they do and how you can change or influence, behaviour in lots of different ways. And so I was really interested in that kind of human-centred approach. So I would say it was both of those, and both have become colleagues. I mean, Nick has now retired, but is still a really, really good friend. And yeah, absolutely. Without him, I wouldn't be here. And so my most recent publication was dedicated to him. And my son has one of his middle names is Nick. So
that's lovely.
Yeah.
You talk in a really lovely way about the impact those two people had on you, and you're now Director of Community and Wellbeing in the Law School in Leeds. How has that experience impacted how you carry out that work?
So I think it's probably in a number of ways. Partly, I talked about the kind of human-centred interests. I always had an interest in psychology. Even as a kid, from a very young age, I remember I used to read a lot of books that were written by a teacher who taught with particularly kind of harder to reach, harder to engage, for want of a better phrase, students. And there were often, very clear reasons why they behaved the way that they did. And I guess I've always been interested in not just saying good isn't frustrating that people act like that, but actually say, well, why? And trying to kind of understand. And I think that sort of sense of trying to understand different perspectives, being human-centred, has hopefully informed the approach that I've taken to that Director of Community and Belonging role. So what we do within that, it's myself as director, but also I have a team. We have a student support team of 5 people, and they obviously do a lot of other work in terms of mitigating circumstances, supporting our students. There's a huge amount of work that goes into that team. But part of what they also do is support the kind of student experience. And so we have a budget from the school, which we actually have a good degree of autonomy over how we use that. And so I kind of collaborate with that team to, get feedback from them about what they think is needed, obviously from our students as well. And the way it looks at the moment is we have some staff student events. So we have things like Eat and Meets. We have a fish and chip van that comes along several times a year. We've just last week, at the point of recording, had a Ramadan Iftar event where we kind of broke fast with about 80 students and members of staff. And we have various cultural events that tie in with some of our students' identities or interests. So we have a Canadian Thanksgiving event, for example. And we, on top of those kind of campus-based events, we do also run some others which are smaller group events, more quiet, I suppose. Some of the kind of crafting events. We have games nights, movie nights, to try to appeal to different types of students and different interests. We also do things like trips to Knaresborough, Manchester, Harrogate, which our international students in particular really like. I think some of our home students have probably been dragged there on family trips or geography trips. I never want to see Malham again. I'm sure it's a lovely place, but I remember being dragged there for a geography trip. Whereas obviously for our international students, they really love that kind of going out into the countryside and seeing somewhere different. So we have those trips, bowling excursions in Leeds, all sorts of things. So we try and look at different personality types. Some people might want to be in larger groups, smaller groups, and different interests that people might have.
That brings me nicely to an area you're really interested in, which is students who are more introverted and ensuring they're properly supported in class and thinking maybe about how we assess those students. Could you tell us a little bit about your thoughts on kind of how we can better support students who are introverted?
Yeah, this is something I've only really relatively recently started looking at, having listened to the book Quiet by Susan Cain, which is not a recent publication. It's from 2013. I started listening to it because I was interested in whether or not that could help with some of the silences that I think we all experience when we're teaching, particularly in smaller group sessions, and people not answering questions or not even asking questions sometimes, and also perhaps the kind of reluctance to come to academic support hours, I'm sure a lot of places, for people who are listening, they'll also have, 2 hours a week or whatever it might be, where they are just in their office and it's drop-in or appointment sessions. And those are often chronically underused. And I just happened to see a kind of blurb about this book and thought, maybe that'd be interesting. And anyway, it actually opened my eyes to all sorts of different issues and ways of thinking. But one of the things that really made me reflect heavily on is the emphasis that we place on communication and wanting our students to talk in seminars, whether talking to us or talking to each other. And that kind of active learning style that actually we see in primary school. My 6-year-old son sits on a table of 3 other people and they all face each other, and he is very quiet. And I suspect he finds that quite overwhelming, actually. Whereas my other 2 children, that would be fine for them. And we see it in primary school, we see it in secondary school, and then they come to university and they're often then again put into groups, whether it's for assessment or for seminars or whatever it might be. So it got me reflecting on actually why do we do that, and do we need to do that to the same extent? And people will often point to employment. Well, they need to be able to do this for employment purposes. And I guess I would sort of push back on that a little bit and question whether they necessarily always do need to do that, because there will be some situations where clearly they are expected to work within a team. But actually, if you talk to a lot of lawyers, they're not necessarily working in teams all the time. They're often working in isolation. And I think increasingly, work practices have moved from huge committees to more sort of smaller groups, online working as well, and more written communication. So that it made me kind of reflect on the emphasis that we place on that within our teaching context, but also within our assessment contexts. And I haven't, for a while, I haven't done any group assessments, but I have in the past. And it really made me reflect upon the ways that I prepared students for that group work, and more so probably didn't. I think I was guilty of just expecting them to make it work and to figure it out themselves. And I did over time put structures in place. So, for example, I became quite directive about the fact that through learning through experience that, if they were communicating with each other outside of seminar time, then they had to do through formal university channels, because all sorts of issues came up with some of them using WhatsApp and leaving group members out and all that kind of stuff. So I became quite directive in terms of saying, look, if you have this problem, you need to come and speak to us by this point, and you need to do X, Y, and Z. But in terms of the kind of personality differences and valuing different forms of contributions, I don't think I did do enough actually to prepare the students for the fact that, and to help them to understand that contribution doesn't just have to be about talking, that there are lots of different ways that people can contribute valuably to a group. And I think when it came to the assessment as well, I was probably guilty of being more impressed, so to speak, by those students who were particularly confident communicators, who, held the attention of the room. And I would hope that I wouldn't make that mistake now, because there are all sorts of reasons why somebody might not be comfortable, for example, holding eye-to-eye contact or not fiddling with something whilst they were presenting. So I think it's incumbent upon all of us to try to recognise those differences and actually to value them, but also to talk openly to our own students about them.
You've done a lot of research on resilience across different disciplines in Leeds, and I suppose we have increasing student numbers. You have hundreds of people now in lectures. You have students who are facing a lot of challenges from cost of living, from living away from home or living at home, international students, for example. What are your own thoughts and based on your research findings around resilience particularly in a law school context?
So I think the first thing to say is that, and anyone who's heard me speak about this before will have heard me say this, I actually don't like the word resilience. And the only reason why the project was named that was because it was a pragmatic approach to ensure the funding was gained. The way that we actually approached the research was to look at networks for students, networks of support. I think resilience is, in the kind of common usage of the term, can be seen as something that is about responsibilizing that individual and telling them, if you don't achieve what you want to achieve, that is on you. And of course, sometimes it can be, but there are often wider factors within that, wider circumstances. And so one of the questions that we posed within the final report, which we wrote, was universities and probably other organisations need to think about, ask themselves the question, what needs to be difficult and why? I think sometimes we do things that are not necessary, that make things more difficult for students than they need to be. And it's sometimes just because it's always the way that things have been done. So I think actually periodically reflecting on what we're doing and why we're doing and whether it actually serves its purpose is really important. As far as our students were concerned within the law school, so we looked at second-year undergraduates in law, geography, music, mechanical engineering, biological sciences and medicine, all at Leeds. And there were some common trends across all of those disciplines. For example, unsurprisingly, most of them didn't like failure or feared it. The musicians were more comfortable with it, I think, because they were more likely to have had rejections from auditions or to have messed something up during a performance. The law students and the medics really struggled with this idea of failing, and often the law students had only ever failed at things that were things they could overcome. So they failed a driver's test, they just take it again. Some of the other interviewees had much more actually really profound failures. And what was interesting was how much they'd learnt from that and how that had perhaps impacted their level of comfort with that. I think as far as resilience specifically is concerned, I think we need to think about what can we do to not make things as difficult as they need to be, but also think about what kind of support is appropriate for us to provide in lots of different ways to those students, and what can we do to facilitate those things that we know help. And I think sometimes that is actually about open conversations with them, and we'll perhaps come on to that a little bit later on in the podcast about the kind of ways that legal education might develop over coming years, and differing priorities that we might develop. I think being honest about our own failures and our own challenges is really powerful. Those students will often see us as people who have been able to glide through life, have, achieved academically and have always been brilliant, and, we know everything. And actually being really honest about that is really important. So one of the things I now do in about week 6 in my lectures, so that brings us to about the end of November, is I take time at the end of one of the lectures and say, this is probably the point in term, particularly because our first years, where you are more likely to struggle. You're used to having a half term, a lot of you don't have that. A lot of you are living away from home for the first time. You're probably starting to get on each other's nerves in the halls of residence. You're maybe wondering why you don't have as many friends as everyone else seems to have. It's dark. It's really dark. It's really cold. All of this is conducive to, frankly, becoming a bit miserable. And that can sound really glum, right? So that could sound like something you think, crikey, no, emphasise the positives, Lydia. But I have found that students then actually come back to me even a year or two later and say, I remember you saying that, and it kind of validated my experiences and made me realise that actually this is temporary. So there are lots, I don't think there's an overarching thing that we can do to support the so-called resilience of our students. I actually think a lot of it is smaller things that we can consistently do, being honest with them about our own experiences, offering that insight into what they may well be going through our own experiences, but also through conversations we have with those students. And sometimes it's about language as well. One of the things we found through that project was that when we were thinking about support mechanisms, personal tutoring, those academic support hours, and how they often don't engage with that, it was often because they didn't really know how to. And so they thought, for example, for a support hour, they had to have a question. And so they just wouldn't go because they didn't have a question that they could formulate, but they just felt uneasy about things, but they didn't know how to verbalise it. And so just a simple shift in the language from saying, if you've got a question, come along, to just saying, come along for a chat, has, in my practice at least, has made a real difference, and means that in terms of, if we think of resilience as this kind of, a bit of a safety net, there are all sorts of things that we can do to kind of add to that safety net over time.
We've chatted a lot so far about undergraduate students and kind of pivoting a little bit to postgrads and PhD students. I know a lot of PhD students are really concerned about the academic job market. It's incredibly competitive nowadays. What advice would you give to prospective academics?
I think it's, to be honest, probably an individual thing rather than a generic piece of advice that I can give, because I think everybody's circumstances are going to be different. How much choice you feel over the type of role that you accept or where you end up is going to be down to, that individual. When I was starting out, just took the job that came along that I was offered, and I was very happy to do that and I enjoyed it. But ultimately, it was about the fact that somebody had offered me a job and I just took it, and I found ways of making it work. And I think that that's a really important thing to kind of hold on to, that whilst there will be lots of things that you can't control, whether about where you're working or exactly the type of role that you're doing, if you can try to identify what's most important to you and work out ways of maximising the focus you can place on those things, I think that's really critical, because there are things that I've had to do within my career, roles I've had to do, things I've had to teach that had I had complete free rein, I wouldn't have gone anywhere near. But there was a limited choice. And so I had to then sit down and I think focus on what I could control about the situation. So what could I influence or control? Accepting what I couldn't change, and just saying, right, well, what am I going to do with the hand I've been dealt at this point? How can I make it work for me? And whilst there are lots of complaints about academic careers, so putting aside the job market, just literally within a role, it has changed over the years. I've been doing it for a long time now as well, so I understand it has changed. And there are, in some ways, perhaps less autonomy than there used to be. I do think there is actually still quite a lot of flexibility, particularly compared to other roles, in terms of what we do with our time, how we use that, how we approach certain, leadership roles or teaching, whatever it might be. And so try to make sure that you actually know what matters to you and then maximise the opportunities that you're given so that you can focus on what really matters to you.
You are one of the founders of the Connecting Legal Education Network, and I am a very proud member, and I have spoken at one of the hangouts, as you guys call them. For anyone who's not aware of what CLE is, could you give us a quick overview and a pitch for why everyone should be involved?
Well, it's a network that I run with Michael and Verona, and we are really, really pleased to have a growing number of people who form part of it. As you say, we have hangouts, so those are roughly every fortnight within term time. We do also kind of run a little bit into the summer holidays, but the sort of summer break from teaching. But we're there as a group of really committed legal educators on all sorts of different profiles, nationally and internationally, who are just interested in different ways of doing legal education. And that's what the hangouts are used for. They're opportunities for people to talk about their own practices, talk about their own ideas, and then for others to kind of pitch in and think about how they might use those things in their own teaching practices, but also to form connections with each other and help to solve problems. So there's often a really strong, supportive, chatty element to those hangouts where people say, oh, this has made me realise actually I have this problem in my teaching. It's something I've been trying to solve. And then the other members of the community, just literally in the chat bit of the discussions, will kind of suggest ways around that or, support each other outside of the hangout. So it's just a really nice community of practice that we just feel really, really fortunate to lead on.
I would highly recommend anyone listening to join. If they wanted to join, how can they go about doing that?
So I'm happy to just be emailed, for example. So l.k.bleasdale@leeds.ac.uk. That's fine. And we can kind of hook you up to make sure that you're entered onto our database. But we also have a LinkedIn page, so just connecting legal education, and a Blue Sky page as well. So any of those will be great.
And you're open to PhD students all the way to professor, very inclusive.
Absolutely. Anybody at all, basically, who's got an interest in legal education. And we do also have people who aren't legal educators specifically, but have a role that's maybe adjacent to that, which means that actually they really want to be involved. Like one of our most recent hangouts was with a linguist, for example, who has worked with postgraduate law students. So absolutely.
I've learned and had the pleasure of hearing from a really diverse range of speakers. And some of the themes that are coming out now around legal education are the rise of AI and how that will impact our teaching and our assessment. What are your own views on where that is going? Do you see it as a benefit to our teaching and learning and assessment, or do you see it as a negative?
I think I'd probably sit on the fence a little bit, which isn't always a helpful answer, I know. It's partly constrained by the fact that obviously everybody has to work within the confines of their own particular institution's policies. I do think that those policies are probably going to rapidly change where they haven't already changed. I think it sort of strikes me as a little bit odd in some ways that we all use various search engines to solve problems throughout our daily lives, right, within work or outside of it. And yet in this particular area, there's a real reticence on the part of some to allow students to do so. Now, I think assessments, for example, where they are encouraged to put a prompt into ChatGPT or whatever it might be, and then have to critique the response that they get, is actually a really interesting way of getting them to analyse and to understand the law and to demonstrate their understanding of it. I think, that said, when I look ahead to next year, I've got a new module, completely new module that's coming out that will have coursework as its mode of assessment. And to an extent, I have written that my driver for the assessment and the form of assessment and the focus of it was because it's pedagogically sound. But I had half an eye on the fact that actually, if I were to be challenged on it, I could say, well, there's an extent to which it's not AI proof, but it would be more difficult to use AI to write a really good piece of work because it's a reflective assessment. And that's one of the things that at the moment AI is less good at. But that said, 12 months, 18 months down the line, it probably will be much better. So for me, ultimately, I don't see how we can kind of hold that tide back. And I think that leads to a broader question about what legal education should look like and what the value added is, actually. If you've got tools like AI that over time could become more reliable, not have the fake footnotes and all the rest of it, then what does legal education need to do in response to that? Not just in terms of assessment, but in terms of what we're teaching our students and how we're teaching them. So I've developed this new module for next year, which starts in September, which has no law, will be compulsory for all law students. So it'd be interesting to see how they respond to this because there's no law. And it's actually quite heavily psychology based again. So my kind of own themes and biases are sort of coming through in my own interests. But it's ultimately about, okay, if we think about AI, what it will be able to do, what it can already do to some extent, is answer some of those technical legal questions, is help us to draft things in an appropriate way, etc. What can't it do? Well, it can't replace some of those intrinsically human traits that are needed within a wide variety of professions. Things like empathy, although I'm about to read a book that kind of is arguing that empathy is perhaps an overrated trait, which is an interesting one. So empathy, relationship building, trust, all of those sorts of things that actually within a lot of professions are needed. It can't do those things. And if you're talking about networking, if you're talking about building up relationships, even things like, I've been banging this drum for a while, the National Student Survey, for example, fundamentally at its heart, it's about relationships and trust. You can have lots of different policies and procedures which are absolutely necessary, but ultimately it's about relationships and trust. And so much of life comes down to that. So this module that I've developed in conjunction with Melissa Scalabaran and Rachel O'Connor at Leeds, is focused on the ways in which we can support our students to basically thrive at university and after graduation as well, and to be able to do what it is they want to do and to really reflect upon that in a meaningful way, and to give them some of the skills to be able to, for example, challenge people in a professional and appropriate way when, for example, their own values or ethics are challenged. So if they find themselves in a position where they are being asked to do something or being told to do something that actually really runs counter to what they think they should be doing from a potentially a professional practice perspective, or indeed in a way that challenges their own values, how can they navigate those sorts of situations? How can they better protect their own well-being at university, but also beyond? How can they better align their own motivations with the types of careers that they do? And it sounds like it's very employability heavy, but actually it's much wider than that. And it's drawing upon psychology theories. It's going to draw upon lots of podcasts that I'll be recording with a whole range of people from a range of different professions who will be hopefully reflecting upon some of the challenges they've experienced personally and professionally and how they've navigated those.
One thing you mentioned there about AI, and it strikes a chord in me, is the idea of equality of access to AI. And currently, do you think there is equality of access, that if we have students who are going to use AI, that they are all able to equally access it and use it? Or if not, is that potentially then a barrier to them?
I don't think they do have access to it, no. And I think that's, again, something for universities to reflect upon. If their policy is that they can make use of AI, then actually, we make textbooks and articles, skills sessions, counselling services. We make all of those things available to our students. And if we were to say that AI is something that they should use within assessment or that they could use, then my view would be that actually the universities need to look at providing that for those students, because there will be students who can better afford access to the most recent versions, for example.
My final question for today, and this has been a real pleasure, is over your very successful and lengthy career as legal educator, what are you most proud of?
So the first thing that comes to mind when you ask that is not, it's not publications or awards, it's specific students. And I guess I particularly remember one student who I'm still in touch with. So she graduated years ago and she had serious health complications and had been told on the basis of first year results that she should give up hope of ever being a lawyer, that she wouldn't be good enough. And she is now a lawyer. She did get through the law degree. She had a lot going on. And I remember I'd put something on social media about Nick, actually, and she commented and said, "You need to remember that for some of us, you are our Nick." And I thought, well, that's a lovely legacy to have. And it's really great for somebody to have that memory of me, that I have of Nick, who had such a profound impact. So it would probably be that.
But that's a wonderful one, because again, I think sometimes we can forget that there are hundreds of students in our lectures, and it can be the kindness of one person that student will always remember. So for that student, you were that person. So It's lovely that that's the thing that immediately sprang to mind. I'm really grateful, Professor Lydia Bleasdale, for joining us on LawPod today. I would actively encourage anyone to join the Connecting Legal Education Network. It is wonderful. And we'll leave it there, and many thanks.
Thank you.